I'd like to first tell you that just to make a connection with you, that I have a great love of Rome and of Italy in general. And James Hillman and I visited Rome together a few times and spoke together in Firenze. And also, I might mention, some of you may have known Bianca Garoffi and Pierre Denevel, who lived in Trastevere, and I spent some wonderful weeks there with them and getting to know Rome a bit. And so my heart is very much with you today in that respect. I'd also like you to know that I have a PhD from a doctorate degree from Syracuse University in the United States. And for my dissertation, I wrote about Marsilio Ficino, who lived in Careggi, just outside Florence, in the from 1433 to 1499, in the 15th century. And when I wrote that dissertation, there wasn't much written about him. And so I read his work in Italian, in Latin, and translated it for myself. And felt very close then to the world of Marsilio Ficino, and have since then constantly learned from him. So he is my Italian resource. Mentioning something about my degree in religious studies, that was my PhD, religious studies. It reminds me that I feel that what we call archetypal psychology, or I think most of the psychology that Jung did, was actually depth theology. A depth theology, a study of the mysteries, the great mysteries that are part of our experience. It seems to me that our psychology begins and is founded on the idea that we find in Jung and other followers of him, that we don't live our lives from our intention, from our mind, from our ego. We live our lives in response to the powers, to the archetypal powers and themes that come through us, that invite us into their worlds constantly. So in that sense, what we do is a kind of depth theology. Of course, I don't mean at all that I'm talking about the religion of belief and literal religion, not that. It's time, I think, to move on from a literal approach to religion and do what James Hillman suggested, to make it a religion of the soul, rather than a religion that is literal and only of the spirit. I would like to read you a few lines from Hillman on this subject. This is at the end of his basic book, Revisioning Psychology. He says, psychology as religion implies imagining all psychological events as effects of gods in the soul, and all activities to do with soul, such as therapy, to be operations of ritual in relation to these gods. That whole last section of revisioning psychology is on this very important question. I think what would help us to orient ourselves in our deep psychology if we could understand that we are not being as rational as most psychology is, rationalistic. We are instead devoted to these deep issues, that these deep powers and mysteries that we have to deal with in our daily lives. And when you are a therapist, you are engaged with the person and working out the real mysteries of their existence. And that is not a mental game. It is not existentialist. It is not psychology in the usual sense. It's a deep religion of the psyche. I know I can be misunderstood on that point, but we can work that out in our conversation, maybe. I'm starting this way because Robert asked me to talk for a while today about the last things, about death and dying. And I would like to do a little of that, but I would like to do it in such a way that I can also talk to you about my basic thoughts, basic ideas. Today is Good Friday, as you know. And some of you, I would imagine, embrace this Good Friday and practice some sort of ritual in relation to it. And others may feel that this is from another time and it's not something for you. So this is an opportunity for me to say that I think that it is a dangerous thing to lose religion altogether. I don't mean official, organized religion, but some form of sensitivity to ritual, an appreciation for the mystery of life, a relation to nature, to the natural world that has some piety in it, some devotion. So I think today, and I'll speak mainly then to the people who may not feel that Good Friday is terribly relevant to them, or to all of us really, that we have an opportunity today to maintain, to keep the religious traditions of the world in a new way. And of course, one way that I think most of us understand is not to just choose one, but to see that all the religions speak to the soul in a specific way. We haven't seen that much because almost, I would say the great majority of people think of religion as a spiritual thing or as literal, an organization, a tradition, a set of beliefs. But the religion of the soul is an honoring of the great mysteries that we deal with every single day. The tradition is, and this has been very strong in Italy, the tradition is to to imagine these powers and mysteries of life as the great gods of the polytheistic religions, gods and goddesses. And so Jung and people who follow Jung and people who work in archetypal psychology often refer to the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome, sometimes of India, and other places, Egypt, Northern Europe. Here where I live, the Native American religions refer to them to deepen and reorient their depth psychology. So I think that it would be really helpful if we could come to grips, if we could understand, appreciate this simple idea of Hillman's at the end of Revisioning Psychology, that what we're doing is a religion of the soul and talking about a theology of the soul. It's not as rational as we may think. So let's apply that to Good Friday. So Good Friday is a day of contemplation, contemplating a great story of the execution of a very idealistic teacher, Jesus, of course. So when you think of it this way, this is a mystery for everybody. It's not for Christians. It's not just for Catholics. It's for every human being. Every human being has to deal with this mystery of the how an idealistic people often are punished by their society that doesn't understand them or doesn't like that idealism. We might call it the Jesus puer approach. Puer, meaning boy, Latin boy, I'm sure you know. The puer psychology of Jesus, which is very clear in so many ways. Someone who walks and wanders and has many friends around him and teaches a very idealistic philosophy and often speaks from hilltops and mountaintops, up there where the puer lives. That is one of the mysteries, and we see it in our world constantly. And we might see it in our own personal lives and in the lives of our clients. Good Friday happens to us all. It's not a bad idea to meditate and reflect on the mystery of Good Friday. This idea that someone with excellent values and an incredible philosophy and would be arrested, tortured, and executed in a violent way. So in one sense, Good Friday is very useful for all of us to reflect. What I do is my ritual every Good Friday. I've been doing it for many years. I listen to the St. Matthew Passion by Bach, J.S. Bach. I love classical music. So I listen to that every Good Friday as part of my ritual. Music speaks to me, that kind of music does. And to me, that's one of the most beautiful pieces that I know. So I listen to that every Good Friday, not as part of any religion, institutional religion, but my religion, the religion of my soul, a soul religion. And I think we could do that. It would be a great benefit for us. to be able to see things in that way. Those of you who are therapists might reflect on this also, that you may think that your job is to interpret your clients' dreams, interpret their lives, understand who they are and what they're going through, and through that understanding achieve some relief from symptoms and suffering. That may work. That may be part of the work, certainly. But another approach, and I want to talk about this to you later today, is not to interpret so much. Interpreting life and dreams to the point of really trying to understand them and understand people. We may be going too far and we may be overlooking other ways to relate to our clients. Those ways might be less mental and more in line with what I'm talking about, more devotional, more poetic, more ritualistic. So imagine then if someone comes to you who has a strong puer nature in the way of idealism, that kind of puer spirit, and is trying to save the world. There are a lot of those people around. All of us might have some of that in us. And this very frequently causes a great deal of suffering and the frustration that the world doesn't change. I think that this spirit, this symptom is very strong today because of the war in the Ukraine, especially, and for other things, but especially today. And some people are also discouraged by the pandemic, the COVID, and discouraged that life has been so diminished by it and threatened. But it's sort of a Good Friday, you know? That's a Good Friday experience. That means that we are faced with the discouraging aspects of life too, and with the fact that we are not going to be understood, and that our idealism will frequently fall, just like the puer typically falls and collapses. So there is a couple of thoughts. I want to add just maybe one more about last things. Couple things about that. One is that it seems to me that one of the biggest obstacles to dealing with our own death, and this is a good day to contemplate our dying and the shortness of our life, our mortality. Just as part of the rhythm. Today's Good Friday, Easter is only 2 days away. So it's this moment, a moment of reflection on our mortality. And I think that one of the things that gets in the way of feeling okay about our mortality is the fact that in our world, we have chosen, or maybe we haven't chosen, but it turns out that we live the life of the hero, We have a very heroic approach to life and a heroic way of thinking, even in psychology and even in depth psychology and even in Jungian psychology. There is a strong heroic sense. It might just be the feeling that I can conquer the illnesses that are coming toward me, the symptoms, the problems that people have. I can help them get rid of those. That, I think, is one of the difficulties in regard to the last things, the dealing with our mortality. If we might consider an alternative to the heroism, the hero that has to slay a dragon, that has to fight an enemy. Just think of all the language we use in psychology of dealing with people's problems and suffering. I would suggest that you look and see how much it is heroic. And in this particular context, what I'm saying now is that we could all deal with our mortality, with those last things better, if we had another approach, not so heroic. Because the hero is in a situation where either he succeeds or fails, or is in a battle where he wins or loses. There are other ways of being in life, and I think it would help us a great deal. I find, for myself, I find that the religious traditions help me a great deal in getting away from the hero. For example, I read the Tao Te Ching regularly and find that this particular kind of Taoism that is right from the Tao Te Ching helps me. It's a very poetic, meditative text that tells us not to be heroic. One of the lines from the Tao Te Ching is, "Let things take their course." That's not heroic. And I believe that the archetypal psychology that I learned from my friend, James Hillman, is to a large extent not heroic. There are many elements where we try to find a way to be in the world that is not the hero trying to win the battle. Maybe more the life of the artist. That's an alternative. It's not the only one, but it could be also. I find one of my great teachers, I don't know if you know him, he's not known so well outside of the United States, is Henry David Thoreau. When I speak in other countries, I'm surprised how people have not read him much. He lived only an hour's drive from where I live right now, where I am right now. So I guess that makes him a little more familiar to me. But Henry David Thoreau was someone who lived in the natural world primarily and didn't want to get into all the struggles of cultural life quite so much. Maybe that was an escape to some extent, but I don't really think so. I see it more as an alternative to the hero. Let me give you a simple, tiny example. I was reading his essay on walking. He teaches us how to walk. And he says, when you leave your house in the morning to take a walk, don't decide where to go. Don't decide which direction to take. Just go and find out where you're going. Discover where you're going. Don't decide. You see, it would be more heroic to make your decision and have an intention. That's typical of his teaching. So what I'm saying is that there are many alternatives to living the heroic life, and I think that would help us prepare for our dying. I'm speaking now to you. I don't know, you don't know about these things, but I'm 81 now, and I think about these things more seriously than I used to. And so it's a very important question to me. How do we get the lesson of Good Friday, and how do we deal with our mortality? How do we prepare in a way for our dying? Something people don't want to talk about much, but it is a very good form of contemplation. Robert told me that you are interested in the subjects around therapy. And I just finished writing a book on therapy, so I feel it's close at hand. So I just want to say a couple of things about it. First of all, when I talk about therapy, I always go back to the word psychotherapy. It's a beautiful word, psychotherapy. Psycho, obviously, from psyche. What's the Italian word for psychotherapy? Psicoterapia? So the psyche means soul. It does not mean mind, it does not mean behavior, it doesn't mean personality. It means soul, very clearly. So the focus of therapy is on the soul. And the word therapy is used in Plato. The philosopher Plato uses the word therapy and even defines it. He says, in one of his dialogues, he says, therapy is care or service. Care or service. It is not curing or fixing or making better. It's care or service. And in the dialogue in Plato, the student asks Socrates, they discuss therapy, and they say the service means the way you might take care of a horse. If you have a farm, taking care of a horse, giving it water and food and brushing it down and giving it exercise. I think that's a very good source for us to think about psychotherapy. That what we're doing is we're doing that for the soul. We're doing that for the soul. If you really are interested, I would recommend reading Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro. Euthyphro. Sorry, I didn't give that word to you, but I'll spell it Euthyphro, Euthyphro, where there's a discussion, very deep discussion, very detailed about therapy in relation to the gods. Very, very good. So there we are. We're talking about caring for the soul, essentially, giving care and service to the soul. We are not really trying to make life better. We're not trying to get a person out of a problem, essentially, as a psychotherapist in that regard. We are focusing on care of the soul. So one of the issues that comes up, and I'm bringing this up because Robert mentioned that you are interested, is transference. I have a very simple way of looking at transference. It seems to me that whenever we meet somebody, anyone, under any circumstance, we are bringing a lot of fantasy with us, a lot of memories. Memories are a form of imagination, a lot of images. Our memory, just think of how many fantasies we bring with us when you first encounter somebody. Think about the fantasies you have today encountering me for the first time. There is a lot of transference going on between you and me here. This is a meeting, and we bring our memories and our thoughts about things, our images, our narratives, our emotions. We bring all of that to any encounter. And I would think that's essentially what transference is. Transference is all that big sack of images, memories, and fantasies that we bring when we meet somebody. Even when we are encountering them, after a long time, old friends, you still bring fantasy with you from your past largely, but also, abiding habits of thought that you have. So I think that's the essence of it. We bring these fantasies, and they sort of sort themselves out depending on the circumstances, and certain fantasies and certain of those fantasies, images we bring, have an impact on the relationship, the encounter right then. They become little filters through which we see the person we're talking to and the situation we're in. Just think about this situation right now. We are in two different parts of the world. That probably brings up some fantasy and feeling. There's a part of the transference here between you and me. And that may affect how we think. You may be thinking about me as this American speaking, and that may affect your thoughts and your judgments and your feeling. It may, for good or bad. Or many other things. There's this old guy. Can I learn from this person? Or what is he, What do you have any biases? Do you have some ageism in you that might affect how you listen? Or does that age mean something positive to you? That's part of the transference. And you can see how your history might be playing a role there, but also your outlook on life, your values. All of this comes into the interaction and affects the relationship and what goes on. Might affect it very seriously, in fact. And this is why we have to be careful in therapy about transference. We all bring the fantasies, the images, and the memories. We all bring it. So it's not just the client bringing their fantasies to you as a therapist, it's a two-way thing. Now, counter-transference is also a two-way thing. It's not just what the therapist does. Counter-transference is going to happen between two people too. That means if you pick up that this person is, let's say that might be a good example, I don't know if it is or not, of me being an American or in America. You might associate me with what you read in the papers. And so you may have a hard time. That may interfere with you hearing what I have to say. As I say, though, it could also be the opposite. But it could definitely affect how you hear, and what you listen, how you listen. That would be, now if let's say I am coming through and if I have something, like right now, what I'm saying probably is coming out of some very slight complex of mine about being American. If you respond to that in me, that would be your counter-transference. If you respond to my fantasies, my images and the emotions about this, that will be your counter-transference. So it is important to pay attention, it seems to me. But I don't think that it's necessary to be too technical and too mechanical about that and to limit it too much just to childhood fantasies or to parental fantasies. Those are strong and important, but it's not just those. You have to, in other words, what I'm saying here is, this is also something I learned from my friendship with James Hillman, is to be a therapist always, to always be interested in the psyche, in the soul, always. You don't practice therapy, you are a therapist. You see, there's a difference. when you are a therapist, it never stops. Even when with your friends, you still are interested in the psyche. I felt this very, very strongly in my friendship with Hillman. He and I would go out to dinner frequently. We'd like to go to certain restaurants. We'd go out to dinner. And he was always, always seeing the psyche everywhere. He was always the psychologist, always the therapist. It never turned off. I never saw it turn off in him. And I felt it was one of his strengths, that he could understand that we're always in transference. We're always encountering people with our fantasies and dealing with theirs. We are in a dream in that sense. We are in the realm of dream, of images. And that requires then for you, it's difficult to express this, that requires a shift in you where you become someone who always sees and is interested in the depth dimension of what's happening, always, in whatever is going on. You have an interest in how the psyche presents itself, how the soul presents itself. Hillman was always interested, especially in the odd ways, the strange ways that the psyche presents itself. And he was not judgmental about it. That was another thing, and that's something I recommend to you. Notice where you make quick judgments when you see the psyche, especially when it's strange. For example, I remember one time he and I encountered this man. We met him on the street, and we knew that he was a man who liked to dress in women's clothes. He liked that, very fancy women's clothes. And Hillman was so interested, he just wanted to talk about it, and with no judgment, saying, I remember him saying to me, this is this man's relation to anima now. It's very important to him. He can't lose that symptom, that issue. He can't lose that behavior. If he stops wearing women's clothes, he might lose contact with the soul, with the anima. But what I'm saying then is that you can be interested in the psyche because you are a psychotherapist. You are a soul therapist. And that means that you always are interested in the soul and not other things. You are not the kind of person who analyzes and quantifies everything, learns everything from the laboratory, or just from theories and your techniques. You are someone vastly interested in the soul. And it takes your attention all day long, every day. And you study and learn. You are then motivated to learn as much as you can about the soul. My students sometimes say, when I tell them to read Jung, something in Jung, they say, how much should we read? I tell them always, read the entire collected works. Nothing less. Read everything. Which Hillman should I read? What book of Hillman should I start with? Read all of them. Get all of them. Buy all of them. Get them in a big collection. Have them there and with the intention of reading all of them. Which myth should I read and get to know? All of them. Never stop learning mythology. Always read. Which poet is the best poet? All of them from every country. Constantly expand your repertoire of the poets. One more thing, slightly different now, I want to end with, and then we can have more conversation maybe. It will take me a little while. Related to this is this very important idea that to live not heroically is to follow guidance, you might say inner guidance, although that's not the best word. Follow guidance, inner guidance. So that means, as Jung said many times, live daimonically, live with the daimon. In Greek, that's, well, D-A-I-M-O-N. I don't know if you, yeah, D-A-I-M-O-N, daimon. Daimonically, this presence that we have in us, that Jung wrote about, that W.B. Yeats wrote about, that Socrates talked about, widely discussed in literature. The daimon, this presence in you that drives you to do certain things and drives you not to do other things. When you are just driven. Lately, I've been writing a new book, and I write the story of when I was 13 years old. I lived in a very Catholic family, Irish Catholic, and a working class family that never traveled or didn't, never read books, or, that's where I grew up. And when I was 13, I became possessed with the idea of becoming a Catholic priest. I became possessed. And I loved my family. I was so devoted to my family, and I never wanted to get the least distance from my family. But I was overwhelmed and possessed by this idea of being a priest. And to do that, I had to leave home, I felt, at 13 years old. And my parents tried to talk me out of it very reasonably, but I couldn't overcome this tremendous force in me. So I went into a monastery, a monastic seminary, and I was there for 13 years of my life, from when I was 13 to 26. And one day, when I was a monk and had lived this life for all that time and loved it and got a great deal from it, I woke up one morning with the certainty that I had to leave it, that I had to go and do something else. I was certain of it. I think, and I left then. I left it completely, although I still try to live like a monk, but I left that life. That was the daimon, I think. For me, that was the daimon speaking, guiding me. And I think that if we want to be good therapists, we have to live daimonically from the daimon. Now, sometimes that means the daimon might take the form of a muse, like an artist muse, telling you what to do and what to make. Very specifically, a muse telling you how to do your work. I think there can be a muse of therapy. You follow the muse of your work. You don't just make all your decisions mentally. You follow your muse, the muse of the therapy, muse of therapy. I haven't heard that talked about very much, have you? I think it should be. The therapist's muse, just like the painter's muse or the musician's muse. So important. Of course, first read the mythology of the Muses. You'll understand what muse is better then. Muse is not just some inner voice. It is a potency in the world. It's a power in the world and life. If you are open to it, you can do wonderful things creatively. It's not just an aspect of you. It's not part of you. It's itself. It is a being. It is itself a muse. And you can live in relation to your muse, to your daimon. And this would change your life dramatically. So I would suggest this too for you as therapists, to live daimonically, not to be so in control of everything in your life, even in your day-to-day life, making choices that are more from the muse and the daimon than from your own mental subjectivity. I think that would change the style with which you live and work. It makes a radical difference. It's one more way to get away from the domination of a kind of heroism that doesn't work very well. And it's an openness, it's an openness, saying, what should I do next? It's a little like Thoreau saying, which way should I walk when I leave my house? Let the muse decide that. Let the muse of walking decide that. So imagine if you lived your everyday life more in relationship to these figures. Someone asked that question a while ago. How do I live with the relation to the archetypes? Well, this is how you do it. You pay attention. Each archetypal figure, each mythic figure is its own kind of muse, its own kind of daimon. This is very traditional. I learned this partly from Ficino, who said that we each have a daimon, and that daimon is determined at our birth. And you can look astrologically at your birth chart to find out what your daimon is. And Ficino thought that the planet Saturn was his daimon, that his whole life was ruled by Saturn. And that he had to appease Saturn, he had to get to know Saturn, he had to live and dress and eat in a Saturn way. That's what he had to do, always be in relation to Saturn. He suggested putting a painting of your astrology, your birth chart, on the ceiling where you sleep. He suggested putting that a painting. You've seen these. You have these paintings there in Italy, all over the place. Paintings on the ceilings, and many of those were of the birth chart, but not in an abstract form, but in the form of picturing the gods and goddesses, personifying them in their position when you were born. He says, when you wake up in the morning, look at that painting. Remember who you are essentially, and then go out into the world knowing who you are deep down. That's Ficino. So one thing that I find therapists that I talk to interested in too is this idea that many people, Jungians, talk about, is creating the vessel of therapy. To create the therapeutic situation, to see it as the alchemical vessel. And I think it's worth reflecting on that. So I might do that just for a minute. It's what we're looking at here is some way to contain therapy, to give it a container of some kind, a place. Also place. It's so important in human life to have a place. And what that place is, and to focus on the soul of the place, and not just take it as practical. For example, sometimes I mention that about the vessel, and I say, how would you understand the vessel of therapy? And people will say, well, first of all, I think about the room in which the therapy is done. And they begin describing the room. And often they don't go deeply enough, They don't go deep enough into the space, even the physical space. here a philosophy of soul is very useful. If you can have the philosophy of soul, that things have a soul as well as people, that things have a soul, and objects have a soul, and places have a soul and a spirit, of course. We know there's a long tradition of the spirit of place, the genius of a place. We know that people, by the way, it comes, my understanding, it comes from old Roman literature. In Rome, they spoke about the genius and having representations of the genius, like it might be a personification. It might be just, very often they were small, the small statue of a kind of gargoyle or animal, half human kind of figure that would represent the genius or the spirit of a place. You might, in your therapy room, in order to give more soul to your space, you might want to have some sort of genius figure. And you might want to read about genius to see what that was, what that means. It's much deeper than you probably understand. So there would be great importance, I would say, in finding an object, especially a personified object, a little figure with a face or a body, that would represent the spirit of that room, of the spirit of the place in which you want to do your therapy. Now, what I do in my room, just for example, I have a statue of Asclepios, the Greek god of healing. I have a statue of Thomas More, St. Thomas More from England. This statue was given to me when I gave some lectures in Maastricht in the Netherlands a few years ago. They gave me as a gift this handcrafted bronze statue of Thomas More, and I have him. And he's there as part of the spirit of that place, the soul, giving soul to the space. And I have many other things, but I know that you understand these things. Most therapists have some way of making their space special that way, but think of it in this sense that is very much in the spirit of Marsilio Ficino, that he would say that you put your statue, your painting or your sculpture, you put that in your space, or maybe it might be like crockery, something like that, a bowl even, something like that. You put it in your space. And he would say that thing will attract the spirit that has the quality of the thing. So if I put a statue of Thomas More in my room, his spirit is, Ficino would say, his spirit is being attracted. And he has a presence in that room now because of that statue. So that's part of creating the vessel. It's not just a physical space in which you can be, but what's in that space? What spirits are floating around in the atmosphere of that space? It's very important what is there. The objects you have, and some of them may be unconscious. You may have things in your space unconsciously that are not helping your therapy. It may not be a good idea to have the DSM right there where the client can see it. So basically what Ficino is saying is that living here on Earth, we have these planets circling us in orbit, going around us. Each one is different. Each has the name of a god or goddess. Sorry, the sun and moon, slightly different. And Ficino says, following El-Kindi, that rays coming down from the planet, from each planet, strikes the earth, they strike the earth and affect, they kind of infuse their qualities, their mythological qualities into whatever they strike, an object, a natural thing, a human being, or something made, man-made. And these rays from the planets are beneficial. They have power. They can help us. So sometimes, at some time in life, you may be depressed, and you could use some of the rays of Jupiter, let's say, who's a very easygoing planet. On the other hand, you can really deal with your depression better if you get rays from Saturn, who is that is the god of depression. So this developed then, Ficino developed this into a practice. And he says you can do this artfully and consciously, make things that will attract the rays of the planet, the rays that you want and need. And that means that, and he says this, you need someone who's good at making images. Get them to make an image that will attract the spirit of a particular planet, and you will benefit from the spirit of that planet. And that could be done with music, make the right music. And he himself invited people to come to his house, according to his letters, come to his house, and he would play some music for them, getting some of the spirit they would need. This is quite amazing when you think of it. It's a kind of therapy. Ficino placed soul at the very center of all of his work. But he said that, imagine that let's say you are feeling something disturbed, something's disturbing you. You go to Ficino for therapy, and he says, I will play you some music that will help you with that. He had a stringed instrument. He called it his lyre. And he said, I will play this music for you, and that will be the therapy I can offer you. And he knew what kind of music to play because he had worked out the music. He had developed a whole set of music that, according to the planets, that he could play for the people who would come to him for therapy. And he also said that not only music, but plants. He suggested having certain plants in your house that would, each of them would absorb and then make available the spirit of that particular planet. And he also suggested what he called fumigations. That's the Latin word, kind of it's English, but that's the Latin word that he used, fumigation. So smoke or incense could do that. And he would bring that into play. Francis Yates says that the great painting of Botticelli, La Primavera, is not a piece of art so much as it is a talisman, a piece of magic that Botticelli wrote or painted to contain the spirit of Venus, to be available to the people who needed and wanted it. A lot of people say, the historians say that that painting was made for a wedding, as a wedding gift. And it seemed appropriate to give them, the married couple, the spirit of Venus. That all Ficino himself called natural magic, magia naturalis, natural magic. And I think it's important because, first of all, it introduces a theme that this is what I wanted to talk to you about in this part of our conversation. Magic and the role of magic in caring for the soul and the role of magic in therapy. Ficino developed this practice that he called natural magic. And he said there was nothing supernatural about this, but he thought it was very important to design your space, whatever you're doing, to be very careful of the colors, the textures, the designs, every aspect of the space. Leave nothing to chance. Make it art. Make it your art. But it's a magical art, natural magic. And this was part of his general plan to make a more soulful society. That's why I think it's important, worthwhile, I don't know if important, but useful for us to talk about that possibility. And recently, in the past year anyway, I wrote a chapter for a book that was published on the Red Book. Murray Stein edited it. And I wrote a chapter on Jung as magus, Jung as a practitioner of magic, because I think Jung was in the spirit of Ficino in this. We know, I mean, just the Red Book itself is a book of magic. It's a book of magic lettering, for one thing. Let me add a little bit to the Ficino story. After Ficino wrote this book, De Vita Celitus Comparanda, it was published widely and read all over Europe. And it was, reprinted and reprinted. And many, many people based their work on that book of Ficino's. As strange as it may seem, this book of magic. Thomas More of England, in fact, was one of the people that introduced it into England. And there were other people who became magicians or magi, I guess you'd say, maguses. And they each focused on a certain way, a certain aspect of Ficino's work. For example, there was one very remarkable figure. His name is Trithemius. He was, I can't remember his dates now. There must have been around 1600 something, I think. He was an abbot of a monastery, but he also practiced magic based on Ficino's work. And his interest was in language and letters. He thought that words and letters have magic and that we could use their magic. Well, I think that's pretty easy for us to understand. Today, when someone's trying to sell a book, they're looking for the title. Not that will say exactly what's in the book, but that will attract the person and get them to buy the book. That's magic. Advertising tries to use magic very seriously. I mean that very seriously. They're trying to find some magic so that they can sell their products. And it might be a color, it might be a design, it might be lettering, it might be a word. I think that's something for us to understand. If we want to care for the soul, if we want to be psychotherapists, we have to watch our language. There's magic in words, and it can work against us sometimes. Words are powerful. They are powerful. They have power. That's what it means. They have power over a person. And if you are going to practice your therapy with, as Jung did, as a magus, as we see in the Red Book, really focusing in on letters, the way he did the calligraphy, the power of letters. Why would he write calligraphy in his Red Book if he didn't feel it had a certain potency to write those letters in that way? Different forms of calligraphy. And he obviously spent a lot of time at it. I think Jung was definitely a magus in the spirit of Ficino. And the other thing is Jung, as you know, better than I am sure, got lessons in stone carving from a nearby quarry. And he learned to work with stone. And he made such amazing things out of stone, something like the Bowling stone or his tower and other things, carving letters and statements into his house and into his tower. That's magic. That is seeing that if you take a word and write it in a certain way, it's going to have potency. So we have to be very cautious with our words, I think, because they're going to have magic whether we want them to or not. And we really should be the person, the magician, who can use the words for their potency and not just for their meaning. We give too much attention to meaning and not enough to the potency of language, to letters, to what we write, to how we write. I mean, just even write with our hands. How you do that is important, it's significant, because letters, as we learn from several of these practicing magicians throughout history, letters is one way in which magic enters our world, letters and words. So that's essentially the Ficino magical approach. It applies to our everyday life. I go myself, I go into hospitals. I have visited many hospitals over the years to talk about the soul approach to a hospital. And I talk to them I give them a brief introduction to this Ficino idea. And then we talk about the colors that are used in the hospital and what plants and what designs and what paintings and what they're doing. And I went to one hospital. I'll give you an example. I went into one hospital where we were sitting in this room I was speaking with the administrators of the hospital. And it was a very beautifully colored room, I noticed. The colors were great. There was sort of a red and yellow tweed kind of color in the furniture and blonde wood, and just a very nice room with plants. And they were trying to put into practice these ideas. And after a while, I was in there for about 10 minutes, and the woman said to me, the administrator said, "Did you notice the imaging machine?" And I looked up, and here on the wall was this, you know how big those imaging instruments are, like the big things you get an MRI, you put your whole body in, and they're very big. We were in a room with this imaging machine on the wall, and I hadn't even noticed it. It had been painted to go with the whole decor. So here's Ficino's idea of color and having to contribute to our health rather than to go against our health. And I asked them, I said, "How much did it cost you to get that color?" And they said, "Nothing. All we had to do was ask for it." I thought, oh, this is a pretty good example of Ficino's idea of how important color can be in the magic of a place. But you'd have to have it in your mind, in your identity, your persona, that I am a magus. I am someone who appreciates the value of magic, and I'm not just someone who thinks everything through. I can create things that have potency, have some power, and I can learn how to do that from the great magicians in our traditions. There have been other people in the past besides the magus figures. Well, let me tell you one that was a magus, John Dee. John Dee was a magus in England at the time of Queen Elizabeth I. And he was a very highly educated man, a mathematician and a philosopher. And he was educated and taught at Cambridge University. He was also a magician, a magus. And he used an obsidian stone, almost like a crystal ball, to contact spirits, like I was talking about, maybe contacting, being in relation to your daimon and so on. He called it angel conjuring, but that sounds pretty bad, but it's not as bad as that. It's about being in touch with one angel might be her muse. And he did it through this Obsidian Stone. And by looking at the stone, I wish I had mine here with me. I don't have it today, right here in this room. By looking at the stone, this black stone, he would answer questions and resolve issues of the government. So Queen Elizabeth actually came to his house, which is quite a remarkable thing, came to his house to consult with him. And he looked at his stone and told her what date she should be crowned, the coronation should be. And he helped the navigators, the great navigators around her who were going around discovering lands, but it's not easy when you don't have maps and ways to find your way. And so he used this stone. And one day I was at the British Museum in London, and they have their little exhibit of John Dee, and they have his stone, his obsidian stone there. I think there is some question of its authenticity, but I think generally speaking, it's considered authentic. And I looked at that stone very carefully. And then when I went home, I got a stone. Even his came from Mexico. They're volcanic stones. And I started using that stone. That was about probably almost 20 years ago. And I've been using the stone regularly ever since. When we make decisions, I always use the stone. I just did it yesterday for my wife, trying to decide about taking a course somewhere. We looked at the stone and figure out what the stone said about it, and made our decision accordingly. This is part of the magic of John Dee. And it's a way of getting out of again, that controlling mental way of looking at life and analytical way, and trying to find a more potent way, trying to find ways that are more intuitive and potent to make your life decisions. We have found it very, very useful in our family for 20 years.
Tom, in the sense that it takes the decision out of the realm of the ego.
Yes.
Is it comparable to consulting the I Ching, for example?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's very comparable to consulting that, or tarot cards. There are many things people use. You can do anything. Right now at this point, I read anything practically. I read someone's cappuccino cup not too long ago. You can read it because you get used, but it does take a little practice and not everybody can do it. Even John Dee was not able to do it. He had an assistant who would look at the stone and tell him what he saw. For some reason, I can do that. I don't know why. I see things, and it really seems to work for us. So and I've had friends of mine I've told them the story, and they went out and bought their stones, and I sold them back because it didn't work for them. I don't understand that, but I suppose it's just your temperament or something. But for me, it really seems to work, and it's like the I Ching. It's very much like that. Only I find it the most potent of all the methods. One thing I like about it, and this is one point I wanted to make here today in talking to you about many of these issues, that part of, like what I'm telling you today, I'm sure you understand, I'm not giving you a whole lot of information, I'm really presenting a point of view, an angle, a way, a style of doing things. So I think if you could get it into your persona, in the Jungian sense of persona, into your persona, that you are a magician, that you are a magus in some way. That means doing things that are not so rational, that the rational people around you might think are strange and maybe they don't approve of. That's pretty good, I think. Not to be approved is a very good thing sometimes. And so taking on that persona, I think, is in itself a good thing, because that's getting closer down into the mystery of the soul. We mentioned before about life as a dream. This is similar to that, life in this dream where you can also relate to the world more magically than mechanically, technically.
Tom, could I steer you gently back to the theme of death again?
Sure.
Talking about decisions and using the stone or using the I Ching, etc. We said it takes things out of the sphere of the ego. And death, of course, is the ultimate dimensioning of the ego. It's the thing that ultimately takes the ego right out of its central place. What can you tell us about this?
Well, I think it's obvious from what you say that a good way to prepare for death is to be less dependent on and less identified with ego. And the old teaching, ancient teaching, was from Plato, I think it is. Plato says that philosophers are preparing for death by reflecting on the great mysteries, the great issues. It's similar to that you prepare for death by, in your style of life, you withdraw, get some distance between you and the control you have over life and the control you have through understanding. I'm saying this in different ways today, that we place too much weight on understanding. And I'm not being anti-intellectual there. I hope you understand from all this, the amount of reading that goes into all of this material. It's not anti-intellectual, but it is understanding that, well, I shouldn't put it that way. It is coming to the point where you can identify more with the magus or the artist than the ego-centered person. You don't have to be in charge all the time. You can let things happen. You can do things that are foolish. This is where I'll tell you again, my source for that is Erasmus's In Praise of Foolishness. You know, his book, which is so great, he wrote it sitting in Thomas More's house. He wrote that book about foolishness. So, and that's a very good book to read, In Praise of Foolishness of Erasmus. And that's written in around 1530 something, I think, maybe even earlier. Thomas More died in 1535. I think it might have been much earlier that Erasmus wrote that book, In Praise of Foolishness. And there's that same idea that it's not being smart and having a lot of analytical words for what's going on can be an illusion. And the freedom, the liberation from that can come from not being so ego-centered, of being able to be something else, the artist, the magus, as we mentioned before. And that gives you very much like Jung talking about the self replacing the ego. You know, it's like it's an expansion of the place from which you live. And I think that's what the magus can offer. Well, I have purposely today wanted to talk to you about a number of different things. They are really all facets of the same thing, or they all come together in a way of life and in a way of work. So I've wanted to talk to you as people and as therapists. And I think that these various approaches here that I've talked about are a way of of living, certainly. And I have a hunch that, it seems to me it's pretty clear that if you're going to be a therapist, you have to live it too. You have to be able to live your life and your work are pretty close together. And so I think it's a great pleasure for us therapists to develop an identity as therapists, to be very loving toward it and to ourselves and to the people we work with, to really love the work that we do, the profession, our identity as therapists, to be proud of it, to hold it high, hold it in high esteem. I really think, I have no doubt that is the most important thing that a person can do in this world. In my book, Soul Therapy, one of the things I talk about there, and some psychiatrists are having some trouble with it, they're telling me, but I try to say there that, that in a way, we are all therapists. Not in a professional way, and I'm not saying that anyone at all should just go along and start practicing therapy. What I mean is that in our day-to-day lives, we have conversations with each other that are therapeutic or can be seen as therapeutic. I like to use that word therapy then, not only as a particular profession, but also as one of the deep ways in which we relate to each other. I wish, going back to the question of war and peace, I wish our politicians and leaders understood that ideally their job is to be a therapist for their nation and for their communities. In other words, you can talk as a leader, you can certainly deal with the particulars of everyday life, the mechanics of having people work together. But you could also speak in such a way that you are therapeutic in a deep sense of the word. Please understand me. I'm not at all confusing a professional therapist with what I'm talking about here. There's a role for the professional therapist, highly trained and developed in that role, which I love working with. But there's also a place, it seems to me, for understanding the therapeutic as something that everyone does. Parents do it with their children. What if parents were, had it in their mind? What if they were taught? What if we actually taught useful things in school that parents could learn how to speak to their children therapeutically? Not in some artificial psychology way. I mean, just as people can offer some skilled ways of talking to children that actually contribute to the children's care and their soul life. So instead of just telling the kids what to do and then punishing them when they don't do it, understand that a child really needs some therapeutic language. Maybe the opportunity, like in a Carl Rogers fashion, just to be heard, just to be listened to, or maybe to be able to feed back in a Rogerian way, feed back what their child has told them. That alone would make such a huge difference in raising children. Develop that sensitivity to say, oh, this situation calls for me to be the therapist at the moment. Not always and not usually, but now at this moment, this is chaos. If something is happening, I need to talk to my child as a therapist. And then maybe I realize that now I got some skill. Maybe I need to go off alone with my child and have a long conversation about what's happening. So that parenting could be therapeutic. Teachers could be more therapeutic. They could do that. I have said this before, I've gotten in deep trouble because people think when they hear that, they just leap somewhere, I don't know where, thinking that I'm saying that teachers should be therapists, like professional therapists. I don't mean that at all. I'm just saying that there is a therapeutic as an adjective, a therapeutic, deeply therapeutic way of talking to a person And if you understood that, if it was in your imagination to think of it that way, you might be able to bring forth then a therapeutic moment to talk. But if you did that, you also need to be prepared for that. And you have to learn something. You have to learn how to be therapeutic. And we could teach that easily to people in ordinary circumstances, very easily. I think if we brought that into into marriage counseling and therapy, it might be useful. There are moments to think therapeutically, to say something therapeutically, not to analyze your partner, but to understand that this moment calls for a more therapeutic statement than just blurting out whatever I think. So that's something that I write about, and I think that therapists could help create a more therapeutic society in that sense. I know people have complained about a therapeutic society and one that is too analytical and psychological and reducing experience to psychological theories. I don't mean that at all. I mean a very heart-to-heart, useful way of being with somebody else. It's somewhat similar to what I learned in Ireland. In Ireland, they talk about anam cara, which was the title of a book by a colleague, John O'Donoghue, from Ireland. But in Ireland, generally, people often use the phrase anam cara. They mean a soul friend, but it means specifically someone who's capable of a deep friendship in which one person can help the other person out to get through tough times. That's part of the definition of anam cara. So that's also like being a friend that can be a therapist. It can be therapeutic in speaking. So that's a point that I think that therapists could help develop something like that to encourage their clients. You know, a lot of clients, when they're in therapy for a while, have fantasies of being therapists themselves. And you wonder about that. Sometimes it happens that they actually become therapists. It's great that I think it's a wonderful thing that they can identify that. By the way, going back to Ficino says that when you have a real friend, that friend is inside you. He said that friend is a presence inside you. And I think that's the kind of friendship that we could talk about in therapy. But I think therapists could, someone says, I'm thinking of being a therapist, or I wish I could do what you're doing. You could say, well, you know, you can do it in a certain way, maybe not professionally, but to a certain extent, in a simple day-to-day fashion, you could learn a few things of how to listen, how to talk, and how to keep confidentiality, how to let people know that they can trust you, help feedback to people what they're saying to you, give them care without judgment. Sometimes that's all that's needed. You know, you could teach how to be a therapist to your client who are asking about that. One of the things I always like to talk about when I'm just speaking to therapists is how to take care of yourself. I think that therapists, you know, it's a tough job. It's an impossible one, really. People are infinitely mysterious and complicated. And we're supposed to, you know, sit with somebody and help them go through things that we haven't been able to get through ourselves in our own lives sometimes. It's a very interesting and difficult process. It's full of funny things that happen, like reversals, where we're dealing with a client, but we're so aware of our own limitations and our own inability to deal with stuff. So I think that taking care of yourself is essential. So I have some suggestions of how we might be. They're obvious, but some things that might be useful. The first one is, I think, the most important thing, and is for the therapist to have friends that they can talk to. Friends, not professionals, not supervision, that's important, but friends that you can talk to. Maybe not talk about cases, but talk about yourself and your work, be able to reflect openly in a context where you're relaxed and you are, it's not professional, but it can help. I remember, I'll tell you about my father. My father was a plumber. He taught plumbing for, 30 years and worked as a plumber. I come from a family of plumbers. And he was just an ordinary guy. He only went to 2 years of high school and dropped out. But he was very bright, very intelligent and gifted and very warm and, person who could really relate to people. He's like, I'll give anything to have half of his ability that way. And my father would spend a lot of his time in the basement of our house, so it was finished off a bit, but he spent time in his collecting stamps. But once every 2 weeks, a psychiatrist who was the chief psychiatrist at the largest hospital in our city would come to our house and go with my father down into that basement room, and they would spend 2 hours talking. And I asked my dad, I said, why is this very high-placed psychiatrist coming to talk to you every 2 weeks? And he said, I don't know, he just seems to need to talk. He needs someone to talk to. And he seems to have found someone in me to talk to. And he came, I think he did that for 5 years or so, this man. And I thought that was so interesting and an example of what I'm talking about here, that taking care of yourself. You don't have to go to a professional, but find some decent person with some intelligence that you can enjoy and sit and talk with and feel open. And I think that friendship, it's friendship that is the key. Friendship is the first key for dealing with the soul generally. And that's true of the therapist and taking care of yourself. The second thing I would recommend for the therapist is some exposure to art. I don't know what art it would be, but either by being a spectator or by being a participant. I studied music myself when I was, before I began to study religions and psychology. And so every day I play the piano. And to me, it's indispensable. A day doesn't go by that I don't sit at the keyboard. When I want to write something, or if I'm starting a therapy session, I'd like to get a few notes, a few things under at the keyboard first. There's something about the arts that take you to a different place. They do refresh the soul, I think, and they prepare you for therapy that is not going to be only mental. Now, what I do, it's more sophisticated maybe. I play Bach on the piano. I play Bach because Bach wrote music. He would come up with, he'd present a problem. He'd give himself this very difficult problem, and then he'd work it out. And I play the piano and I watch and hear how Bach worked out these problems. And they're aesthetic issues, but I think a lot of our issues as therapists, they're not so mechanical and abstract. They have to do with intuition, making aesthetic decisions rather than practical ones. What's appropriate now? What's the right thing? What is a good word to use? These are aesthetic decisions. So I find that if you can have some exposure to the arts regularly, it helps you as a therapist, and it also refreshes your soul when you need, because of the tension that can come from doing this work, the responsibility and the difficulty of it. And you have to admit that it has those difficulties. And maybe the other thing I would say, I find that it's just obvious, but I go back to where we started with Henry David Thoreau. He's leaving his door to deciding which way to walk because he's going into the forest. Thoreau understood, as maybe nobody has understood so well, that the natural world is full of soul. And that's where we can refresh ourselves, in the natural world. It's so important and it's so effective. So I would recommend, and if you live in the city, if there's any way you can get to a park, or I know in Rome, you've got fountains, you've got great, beautiful parks and places to find nature. You can go outside Rome and get into nature, of course. But in other places where you live, you can always have access to the natural world. And it can be small, in these matters, in magic, small doses are very effective. So you don't have to go on a month-long hiking trip. You can just go for a walk and look. You can also find that, I think, in the city, some of the most memorable times of my life were walking in Rome, just walking hours on end. The city has its own spirits and its own places of soul. We don't want to romanticize nature. The city can be a place of great soul. So you can, I'm sure you do that anyway. You cultivate the city that way. Find out if you want to know what would help your soul, find out what you are drawn to and what you love. That would be a sign. But I would do that as a practice, not just something that happens accidentally, but do it as a practice. So those are a few things. There are other things, but those are a few things that come to my mind that as therapists, you could do and maybe need to do in order to be able to do this work. Your soul has to be cared for if you want to care for somebody else.